it look like to be led by the Spirit? After all, we have all watched history undone, where the notion that the Spirit was at work in the world led churches to violently take land and people, belonging and hope. There are those of us who would use their understanding of the Spirit at work to ensure that white supremacy prevails, to justify genocide and war, to justify the persistence of inequitable systems, to suggest who belongs and who does not. After all, would the early Jewish believers of the early church not suggest that it was the Spirit who insisted that they must follow the purity laws, thereby excluding the Gentiles from worship? Not much has changed since then, but we also have those whose stories are not written in books and are not made into movies. Those who suggest that to be led by the Spirit is to despise themselves. Imagining who they are at their core does not fit the notion of made in the image of God, thereby relegating themselves into the corners, hiding behind masks, trying to be who they are not for the sake of the Spirit, for the sake of the church. Those who stay in relationships that are cages, hiding the bruises on their hearts and faces, the bruises that lace their hope and their backs for the sake of the Spirit and for the sake of the church. We know that it was not God who drove a world towards human slavery then and what continues today. We know it is not God that suggests the bruises are his handiwork. We know it is not God that closes the doors of the church towards actions, words, and policies that speak belonging. Yet it was the very idea that God said and the Spirit led that walked those who have gone before us down these anti-Christ and anti-human ways of being. So there must be more to the phrase. There must be more than just a feeling, more than just a simple recitation of a verse or listening to a song that clarifies what it means to be led by the Spirit, to be ones who hear and respond to God at work in the world. That is why the word discernment and its practices are essential to those who are both a part of the church community and ones who are intentional followers of the way, followers of Christ. The work of discernment is to be able to resolve through prayer and community, scriptures, and the relationship one has with God and self to determine where God is leading and what the Spirit is speaking. And as you can imagine, it is the type of work that when mishandled can become all about control and power, but when used rightly should point us in the direction of Jesus, to move in the direction of where Jesus is moving, regardless of the cost, regardless of that which is lost and that which is gained, which is partially why it is so difficult. Can we be led by the Spirit if it causes us to lose something? Can we be led by the Spirit if it causes us to let go of something? Can we be led by the Spirit if it causes us to take on one more thing? Can we be led by the Spirit if we find ourselves walking through the valley of the shadow of death? These questions have followed those who seek to be followers of Jesus for centuries, and so we won't magically arrive at an answer at the end of Lent when it's all said and done. But hopefully, if nothing else, we can see more clearly and hear more acutely. Now, John 9, which we heard part of today, offers us this case study of discernment and what it can look like in real time. I lean heavily on Ruth Haley Barton's work in her book, Pursuing God's Will Together. And in this, she offers us a picture of what discernment looks like, both when we get it right and when we get it wrong. John 9 begins with Jesus walking with his disciples when he notices that there is a man who is blind. We learn early on in the passage that this is a man who has been blind since birth. And the disciples immediately wonder, was this man blind because of his sin or because of his parents' sin? How loving and compassionate. It was supposed to be funny, fail. sorry. Anytime you have to explain it, Keitha. Jesus responds, "This happened so the power of God could be seen in him." In other words, you are asking the wrong question. Rather than wondering where to assign blame, which category the man fits into, or if he can or cannot belong, Jesus insists the better question is, what is God doing in this situation, and how can I get on board with it? A question that seems to be the best possible question that we can ask whenever we find ourselves entering a season of uncertainty, change, or opportunity. A season that requires discernment. As we consider what it means to be led by the Spirit together, what might change in how we respond to an issue? What might change in how we respond to a question, uncertainty, a next step, if we are brave enough to ask, what is God doing in this situation? Not as a means to dismiss what's happening around us, not as an opportunity to perpetuate some kind of toxic positivity or to tell a false narrative about the possible negative or positive outcomes, or as a means to avoid naming what is evil or heartbreaking or disappointing, but instead as a posture that invites us and those walking with us to move forward with open hands as we wonder, in this situation, in this moment, in this time, in this context, in this place in history, this decision-making process, what is God doing? What is God up to? How can I participate? What is required for me to get on board with what God is speaking and with where God is moving? Jesus reminds the disciples that he's the light of the world, a profound statement in response to their ill-considered question. The light will shine both figuratively and literally as Jesus bends down and spreads mud over the eyes of the blind man and instructs him to wash himself in the pool. And it is upon emerging from the pool that he can see. He emerges as one whose former categories and titles no longer suit him. He once was blind, but now he can see. And those watching, those rushing out to see if it is true, friends and passerbys, can barely believe their eyes. Is this the same man who used to beg on the corner? Is this the same man who was born blind? Is this the same one we used to pity and step over? And the crowd's uncertainty reaches the ears of the man himself, and he loudly declares, "I am he." You can imagine he would expect some celebration, some jubilation, some kind of celebration. Instead, the crowds are quizzical. They remain unconvinced. How can a blind man see? His healing doesn't fit their narrative. It doesn't fit what they have always known to be true, what they have experienced. The neighbor's predicament points out another difficulty we have with seeing. We only see what we are ready to see, what we expect to see, and what we desire to see. How desperately we need practices, experiences, and questions that help us get outside of our paradigms so that we can see old realities in new ways. As we gather around that idea of being led by the Spirit, what words and phrases need to be looked at through new lenses? What norms need to be filtered through new perspectives? What questions need to be asked with increased openness for new and surprising answers? What stands in our way from seeing what is with fresh eyes, rather than trying to fit what we see into old paradigms? The crowds are so confused and uncertain, somewhat shaken by their norms being undone, that so much so that they bring the man to the Pharisees, the religious and spiritual leaders. And I love how it is written. They took the man who had been blind. This reality remains. Once blind, and now he sees. Yet the focus is not on what the man has acquired. It's not on what he has achieved or gained. There's no celebration, no wonder, no amazement at what has happened. Instead, everyone wonders if this is real. Everyone wonders if this is godly. If this can be contained within the forms and the functions, the ideas and the ideologies that have already been established. Now, bringing the man to the religious leader should be an opportunity for this story to shift, for the questions and the uncertainty, the denial of the man's transformation to be upturned as his healing is validated, accepted, and celebrated. But when you have a system to keep, when you have a way of being to maintain, a way of seeing to uphold, to celebrate this man's healing would be to accept that your system and your way of being and seeing is not all that there is and is somehow insufficient. And if ever there is something that systems and institutions and ideologies resist, it is this: the admission that they do not hold all of the answers. A posture of curiosity can be the most frightening thing for those who are certain they already know the answer. And this is precisely what we find when the man born blind is brought face to face with the religious leaders. The man tells them his story. He was blind, and now he sees. A man put mud on his eyes, told him to wash in the pool of Siloam, and when he came out, he could see. The Pharisees aren't happy about this. How could an ordinary sinner do such a miraculous sign? They turn to the man who is healed and ask for his opinion on the matter, and the man declares he must be a prophet. At this moment, it is easier for them to believe that the man who claims he was blind is lying than to believe that the man was healed by Jesus. So they call in his parents. Surely this will reveal all things. But even the parents don't have anything new to offer, except they know this is their son. They know he was born blind. They know that now he can see. But rather than celebration and praise, they are terrified. To insist this is the work of God, this is the very thing they had hoped for and prayed for, would cause them to lose their community. It would cause them to lose their capacity to worship, their access to the synagogue. And so then rather than joining in with curiosity, with a wonderment about what God is doing among them, they cower behind the one who is healed for fear of what it will cost them to acknowledge that God has done a new thing among them and for them. Their answer, their confirmation that their son was indeed blind and now can see is disappointing. How will they respond without losing their ideas about what is true, how God works, and what it looks like to follow? So as the religious tend to do, they quickly find a way to acknowledge the healing without acknowledging the healer. They confront those listening with this well thought out idea. Well, we really ought to give God the glory and not some common sinner. Anything but point people in the direction of where God is and what God is doing. But the man who has been healed is not so easily moved by their ploys and responds, I don't know if he was a sinner, but what I do know is this: I was blind and now I see. But for those whose greatest good it is to hold on to a system and to hold on to control, to hold on to what was rather than to move in the direction of where God is leading, this answer isn't good enough. It isn't what they want to hear. They press the man to tell them again, and he is perplexed. Do you want to be one of his disciples? Didn't you hear me tell you the first time? This is the worst thing he could say. They loudly shout out, we are disciples of Moses, and we do not know where Jesus comes from. Yet the man who has encountered Jesus, the one whose life has been changed, the one who is not marred by religion and has no stake in maintaining the system, simply laughs it off. That's strange. He healed me, yet you don't know where he comes from. If this man were not from God, he could not have done it. This is too much. And the one who has encountered Jesus is thrown out of the synagogue. It sounds so familiar to me, doesn't it? His family can barely look at him. His religious community seeks to abandon him. His neighbors seek to deny him. Ruth Haley Barton says, this is how paradigms, systems of thought, rigidly held categories, and unquestioning loyalty to systems function. On the one hand, they help make sense of our lives so that we can function. But on the other hand, they have a powerful tendency to filter out new information, including anything new God might be doing. They can filter out God themselves. The gatekeepers, they get to keep their places. They get to keep their ideas, their foundations of certainty. Everything is safer inside the synagogue. Everything makes sense inside the synagogue. They have all of the answers. They require no curiosity as long as they stay inside the parameters they have both created and insist others follow. But the man who has been invited and the man who has been healed and has left behind his former ways of being and his former ways of seeing, he is on a completely different journey. For him, it is not the loss of the synagogue. It's not the loss of the familiar modes of worship. It's not the lack of acceptance by his family and his community that matters. No, he is set with his eyes and his heart and his whole self in a single direction. His eyes are on Jesus. What is Jesus doing? Where is Jesus moving? While everyone around him was asking all of the wrong questions, the healed man was on a journey of increasing spiritual insight into who Jesus really is. The light of the world was dawning in the man's heart. Ruth Haley Barton notes that in verse 11, the man who encounters healing calls Jesus a man. In verse 17, he calls Jesus a prophet. In verse 33, he calls him a man sent from God. In verse 35, he calls Jesus the Son of Man. And in verse 38, he says, Lord, I believe, and he worshiped him. While the one whom Jesus healed is now focused on Jesus and asking the question, what is God doing and how can I get on board? As he declares that Jesus is worthy of worship, essentially refuting the religious leaders' assertion that Jesus is a sinner incapable of this great act of transformation, the same religious ones are listening in. And Jesus says, I entered this world to render judgment, to give sight to the blind, and to show those who think they see that they are blind. And the Pharisees say, are you talking about us? Are you suggesting we are blind? And Jesus responds with the punchline. He responds with the big idea of the whole encounter. He says, if you were blind, you wouldn't be guilty. But you remain guilty because you claim that you can see. Those who admit their blindness see. Those who are convinced that they see and stubbornly refuse to admit their need for healing will not be able to see anything new. They will not progress on the spiritual journey. This story shows us that true discernment has very humble beginnings. It starts with the admission that we are not all that good at seeing. It begins with acknowledging the fact that we are as blind as bats sometimes, and there are many obstacles we need to overcome. Discernment begins when we acknowledge the fact that we lack the wisdom we need, and that without divine intervention, the best we can do is stumble around in the dark. Discernment begins when we are in touch with our blindness and are willing to cry out from that place, my teacher, I want to see. If you were to sit down with me 10 or 15 years ago, I would have had a very clear and bold answer about what it looks like to follow Jesus. I would have insisted that to be a Christ follower is to be someone whose main concern was getting themselves and their friends into heaven. Well, you know you're long when the kids come back. And I would be ready to denounce anyone who said differently. I had all the tools to do it. My education, my experiences, the teachings I had read, the pastoring I had offered. But instead, God, thankfully, did not allow me to stay in a single space. Rather, I was invited and received the invitation to wonder, what was God up to? And where I was certain that I was right and sure that I had the correct answer and confident that I was moving in the right direction, I began and strived to continue to declare with hands wide open, Lord, I want to see. I want to see where you're moving. I want to see what you're doing. I want to see what you are tearing down. I want to see what you are building. I want to see where you are inviting me to co-create. I want to see where you are asking me to sit and listen, where you're asking me to rise and act. I want to see what I must let go of, and I want to see what I must hold on to. And this stance, this posture has changed me. It means I have fewer answers, less certainty, but so much more love and compassion for those around me. Because there is nothing else that is clear than this. To follow Jesus is to follow love. And so my prayer is that we would wonder together, what does it mean to be led by the Spirit? That together we would not be so convinced that we see all things clearly and rightly. Instead, that we would be a people whose prayer day in and out is this: my teacher, my Jesus, my Lord, I want to see. Kristen, come up. And somehow, I imagine this simple daily prayer will allow us to see more clearly, day by day, what God is doing and how we can get on board.